From the European Parliament here in Brussels, this is Raw Politics. Thank you for joining us tonight, and this is what we have for you on the menu. Macron ultimatum. The French president threatens to boycott Brexit talks over Irish border demands. All options open. The UK Labour Party signals it could throw its support behind a second referendum. Political peril amid death threats and violence. Is being elected more dangerous than ever? Europe versus Poland. The sequel. The EU takes a far-right government to court. And in today's Raw Moment, a handshake fail for Jean-Claude Juncker. Thank you for joining us tonight. Now it's time to meet our panel. We, of course, have Darren McCaffrey, our political editor at Euronews. Darren, which story do you like most?
I think it is politicians at peril, Tessa. Not that it's more dangerous than ever, but it's certainly become more dangerous in the last couple of years. You know, for decades, we were talking about how politics was all very samey and no one was political anymore. That has certainly changed. But what it has meant is this sharp rise on the hard left and the hard right, the violent undertone. I think that is slightly concerning.
Interesting to get into this topic indeed. And also joining us tonight is Bruno Waterfield. He's Brussels correspondent for The Times. Bruno, what are you watching?
Well, it's Macron, because I wrote about it in today's newspaper. So it's sort of raking over the embers of the Salzburg summit and who said what, and the fact that intervention by Macron seems to have been the tipping point, where he said, look, Britain's not making enough progress. Theresa May made it clear that she's not got any room for turning, and I'm not going to turn up in November unless there's true agreement on the withdrawal.
That ultimatum that we were talking about. And also joining us is Marietje Schaake. She's a Dutch MEP with the Alliance of Liberals and Democrats for Europe. Which one do you like?
Well, like might not be the right description, but I think the rule of law in Poland is absolutely one of the more serious topics on our agenda. And I really hope that it doesn't have to come to a harsher confrontation and that they will actually continue to respect the rule of law as they should by signing up to the EU acquis.
Yeah, so we will get into a lot of those stories a lot more later on in the program. But first, let's go to our top story. And no matter who you choose to believe, reported rumours from inside the British Prime Minister Theresa May's Conservatives or suggestions from the opposition Labour Party, UK citizens may be heading back to the polls over Brexit. According to the Sunday Times, May could call a snap election as early as November. Now, this as the Labour Party prepares to vote tomorrow on whether to keep all options on the table regarding Brexit. And as the French president doubles down, here's your Brexit brief. France's Emmanuel Macron is turning up the pressure on Brexit negotiations by threatening to boycott the next big summit in November. Reports suggest he won't attend the meeting unless a withdrawal agreement is finalized in the next few weeks. Macron says that Theresa May must make further concessions to ensure that there's no hard border on the island of Ireland. Meanwhile, across the Channel, Britain's beleaguered Prime Minister has held a cabinet meeting in Downing Street to nail down post-Brexit immigration policy. This comes just days after EU leaders roundly rubbished May's Chequers plan. A majority of her top team now reportedly wants a Canada-style trade deal with the EU. And 300 kilometres north at Labour's annual conference in Liverpool, Jeremy Corbyn is facing pressure from party members to back a so-called people's vote on Brexit. Corbyn has been reluctant to support what many dismiss as a rerun of the 2016 vote, but he's backed down, giving members a chance to vote tomorrow on keeping all options on the table, including a new referendum. I mean, to put it bluntly, it's a bit of a mess right now over there. I mean, again, depending on who you listen to, Bruno, which of these options do you think is most likely?
Well, people keep using these terms like Norway and Canada. It's a good bit of branding by Michel Barnier because he can put a flag on a slide. But no one's really offering Canada. Canada, a free trade agreement has no level playing field. That's a complete innovation that the EU is demanding. Canada didn't have to have any regulatory carve-outs for Quebec, just as Britain needs a regulatory carve-out for Northern Ireland in the backstop. So I think the use of these terms like Canada and Norway tend to really disguise what is going on. And I think what we're going to see is we're going to see more emphasis on the final Brexit agreement as a free trade association plus
rather than a vote on a second referendum on in or out, or a snap election, or a vote to the people?
I think the question of a vote, a second vote, Labour have fudged it. It will be a vote on who knows what. A reversal vote is difficult for Labour because many of its voters, as opposed to its membership, voted leave. I don't think people have really thought through the numbers. If you look at the polling, it's anything but a dead cert, a second referendum. And I think people need to think about what happens if you reverse the referendum. Where will that leave British politics? The EU is politicised as never before. And I detect absolutely no appetite in Brussels, in the Justice Lipsius, in the Commission, for starting all over again. I think people have had enough.
And talking about that appetite, Marietje, what do you think from the Brussels point of view? How are they analysing, how are they looking at what's happening in the UK right now?
I think it's been very, very painful to watch for a long time, to see the big gap between political promises and reality. And I think we're coming closer to a sort of moment of truth where, as you can see, you cannot promise everything without taking the consequences. And I think Theresa May, in that sense, is running up against her own reality. And, I think all of us here in Brussels, no matter which political party you're from, think this is a very sad moment for Europe and for the UK. And I really wish it would not have happened. And
speaking about consequences...
I think we just, first of all, need to look at all these options. Is a deal likely, still likely, the most likely option? Yes, it is. There is no groundswell, really, I think, the general public for a second referendum in the UK. And there certainly isn't amongst most of the political class, because they know how incredibly divisive it would be for Britain. And, if you've got a vote that then reverses the decision, is it then the best of three? It gets... is a general election possible? It is, I think, only by default. If we get to a situation where it seems like there is the real genuine possibility of no deal, because ultimately there is not a parliamentary majority in the UK for no deal.
And yeah, I think we go back to what you were talking about earlier, Bruno, Macron's reaction. Is it symbolic now of what Europe is feeling, saying, well, Britain, you've got to get your house in order? So what does that mean? You wrote about this story.
I think it makes it tougher to get to that final summit, to get to that political declaration, which can be fudgy because it will be done by leaders, it will be a joint product anyway between Britain and the EU 27. If, as it seems after Salzburg, the whole of a withdrawal agreement, apart from maybe a few I's and crossing a few T's, has to be sorted out over the next 3 weeks, that seems to be quite a hurdle for Theresa May to negotiate, principally because of the difficulties surrounding the Irish backstop as an issue which touches on constitutional and territorial elements of Britain's integrity, which make it very, very difficult. Well, party political elements in the sense that there isn't a single political party that supports the Irish backstop as it's currently tabled.
Do you suspect other leaders will follow the example of Macron?
Well, what exactly was
Well, I think they did. I mean, they did. That's what happened at Salzburg. So Macron made the intervention. The door was open. Theresa May had walked into the trap because she'd given the impression she'd essentially given them taken British politics to the table. It didn't play with them. And that is essentially what is going on at the moment.
Well, I don't think President Macron said anything that was new in terms of where the EU 27 stand. I mean, they've always highlighted the integrity of the internal market, the need to avoid a hard border with Northern Ireland. I mean, what do you hear that is new that he articulated?
But sometimes it's not about necessarily what you've said; it's when you say it. And I think, given his tone, it was pretty clear that was sending a message to Theresa May.
And
but I think she could have seen it coming for months, if not longer. So I'm surprised that this is now considered to be a breaking point, whereas I think the EU has been remarkably united and consistent on where they stand.
And Darren, you've been looking at what this means for Europe. I mean, what the impact will be of Brexit.
There's been an awful lot of focus, and there is a continual focus, of course, on what Brexit means for Britain, as there should be. But, if there was this scenario of a no-deal Brexit, it would clearly not be good for the rest of the European Union. It is something that... European leaders recognise. And we got some stats, actually, of the cost of kind of crashing out, according to the IMF. And this is the worst-case scenario, Tessa, but it's, I think, 210 billion euros loss up until 2030. That's the hit to the European or the EU economy, potentially up to 1 million job losses and a drop across the board of 1.5% in GDP. Now, clearly, there are some countries that would be simply harder hit because of that, not least of all economies like Ireland. It shares a land border. It would almost be as badly hit as the UK. The Netherlands, Rotterdam, a massive port. Again, obviously geographically close by. Denmark and Belgium too. So it is quite difficult for the European Union because in the worst-case scenario, which everyone recognises is the worst-case scenario in terms of the political classes and the leaders, if not all politicians, that no deal is very, very, very damaging for the British economy, but also pretty damaging for the UK,
just to put it in context,
EU one as well.
The IMF also said that in the past quarter century, the economic and financial ties grew closer by 40%. I mean, that is incredibly substantial. So that will be the impact on the rest of Europe, potentially. Now let's go to our correspondent, Vincent McAviney, who is in Liverpool. That is where the Labour Party conference is taking place. Vincent, good to see you there. Can you tell us what is going on, with the vote tomorrow? What do we expect?
Well, for the past 2 years, Labour's strategy when it comes to Brexit has been somewhat to lay low, to let the Tories fight it out amongst themselves. They knew that there was a massive rift in the middle of the party, and what they've done is let them go to the polls. So you've got the Brexiteers on one side, the Remainers on the other, really fighting it out, and it has deepened the split in the Conservative Party, and we see that now with them unable to decide, it seems, on what kind of deal they want to strike with Brussels. But lots of people have been saying during this time Labour needs to speak out more, and they have accepted that that was the strategy. But over the past couple of months, people have wanted to really know what Labour is going to do on Brexit. We've seen some Labour MPs, some Conservatives and some Lib Dems calling for a second referendum. We've seen this movement growing for it, and we've seen some of the unions that support the Labour Party starting to support the idea of a second referendum over the summer. And as this conference was getting underway over the weekend, thousands of people took to the streets here in Liverpool to march in support of a second referendum, and it's something that the party has decided it's going to have a vote on. So yesterday they spent a number of hours deciding on a motion that will be put to the vote, and it's whether or not the party should call for a second referendum, and whether that referendum should be on a deal that's before the British public, or even including a provision to remain. Now, late last night, the word was that they had decided after about 5 or 6 hours that they would include provision that it would be all options on the table, including remain. That was seen as a win for the Brexit Shadow Secretary, Sir Keir Starmer. But this morning, things have got a bit more confusing because the Shadow Chancellor, John McDonnell, did a media round in which he said, no, a referendum, a second one, wouldn't include any options on remain. Here's what he had to say.
What we want now is a general election. Let's have a proper debate at a general election. Then people can choose what team that goes forward to negotiate in the future. If we can't get that, yes, we will campaign for a people's vote where people can have their say. But we'd much prefer a general election.
Now, both John McDonnell and the Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn say that they would rather have a snap election because they have then the chance to get into power and to try to change the deal that would be put before Brussels more directly. Jeremy Corbyn saying he wants to negotiate for a customs union, so not staying in the customs union, but setting up a new one, something that the EU has previously said it's not interested in. But in the past hour, Sir Keir Starmer has come out and said that no, whatever the vote is tomorrow, it should include in that second referendum the option of remaining. So a bit of a battle here at Labour conference over the next 24 hours ahead of that vote.
Thank you for that, correspondent Vincent McAviney there in Liverpool. Bruno, Labour at the helm of Brexit negotiations, is that something that could be possible?
Well, I think you need a pretty long extension to the Article 50 process, I really do. And I'm not sure about the appetite here for that. The Labour Party's policy on what it would want in the negotiation seems to be pretty much where the Conservatives were in 2016 in terms of having a cake and eating it. Can Britain be in the EEA whilst being in a customs union with the EU? That means no EFTA route. So it means changing the treaty. I think it would be pretty difficult, actually. And I really, really, really don't think that other European countries would be excited about the idea, which Corbyn really, really wants, is taking the sort of boot off Britain's neck in terms of state aid policy.
Yeah, and just going back to your point, Marietje, of the consistency of the positions of the different EU leaders. But at the Salzburg summit, it was floated by two countries, like Malta was one of them, the idea of if there were a second referendum, that the in and out question could still be out there. You think that's a minority opinion?
I don't see how it can happen within the timelines that are there, but I do think that a lot of people in Europe, and that has been said by leaders from Barnier to Tusk repeatedly, that we'd be happy to, avoid this hard Brexit, the Brexit the way we see it coming, because I think it's a lose-lose situation. I mean, let's not look at this whole Brexit as if we're watching a soccer match with winners and losers and taking out the popcorn. This is a very serious problem for all of us. I think it is a lose-lose situation. And the political stress and sort of chaos in the UK, whether it's at the Labour Congress or in the Tory party, I think speak for themselves, frankly. I mean, isn't it evident that it hasn't created the sort of hopes and dreams that were promised to the voters before the first referendum? So I think it is absolutely justified to think about the people's voice in going forward and what the consequences of Brexit would be.
Yeah. And I just want to add that, the Labour leadership has not provided any leadership when it comes to this issue of Brexit. No. It is clear that they have left it up to the Conservative infighting in the hope that the Conservative Party will destroy itself, that there will be a general election and that Labour will get elected. They are, self-admittedly, in a very difficult situation. I think 10 of the most Remain constituencies in the country are Labour, and 10 of the constituencies that voted most to leave are also Labour. That is a difficult place for the party to straddle. But to date, they've shown very little sign, apart from Sir Keir Starmer, of actually any form of leadership on this. Jeremy Corbyn wants to get into number 10. I'm not entirely sure he knows or wants to solve this Brexit conundrum.
Indeed. I mean, we have less than 6 months to go, and, deadlines keep moving. But I think there is a desire to keep that deadline to March 2019. That we
200 days. Is it 200 days?
Yeah, less than 200 days now.
Less than 200.
All right, we'll leave it at that for now. Let's move on to another story that is getting the attention of people here in Brussels. The EU Commission is ramping up its action against Poland in a showdown that has seen Warsaw stand increasingly firm against Brussels. The Polish government will face the EU's top court now for appointing new judges that would favour the ruling Law and Justice party and force existing judges into retirement. Here's the Commission spokesperson Mina Andreeva earlier today.
The European Commission maintains that the Polish law on the Supreme Court is incompatible with EU law as it undermines the principle of judicial independence.
Marietje, I'll go to you. I mean, is there a change here in the way the EU is dealing with naughty countries, or have you seen this before?
No, this is a new case.
So
I mean, the extent to which the rule of law is being violated. Yeah. No, I think it's an answer that has to come to the actions that the Polish government is taking. I mean, we're talking about the very foundations of a separation of powers, of the rule of law, the independence of the judiciary. And if you don't draw a line there and compare it to the treaties, then where do you draw the line? So I think standing for the respect for the rule of law is absolutely vital. And it is the only answer that the European Commission can give to the actions of the Polish government,
but at the same time, we have seen Poland and Hungary, let's bring Hungary into this as well, not being very willing to follow, despite cases that they're put out there.
Yeah, no, I know. All I would say that you have to follow the rule of law, but you also have to respect democratic mandates as well. And I think the EU, in some regards, does find that balance quite difficult.
But don't you think that the governments of these member states have voluntarily signed up to the EU acquis? I mean, nobody's forced them, and there should be consequences.
There should be, but also the sense of what the European Union is and its rules are there and open to interpretation and open to change. That's democracy. Sure. And so that the Europe that the Polish government or the Hungarian government, for one, is clearly a different European Union than, let's say, some Western European countries. But that electorate, those governments, have got a right to represent what their people want.
Yeah, but there is also a possible consequence to those steps being taken by these governments. And I think that that's what this is about. It's not about the lack of the right for these governments to act, but it's about the consequences that would be attached to these actions. And I think an independent court, the European Court of Justice, can have a look on whether the government is within the space to take certain steps, or it's overstepping its space and the acquis of the EU.
I think it would really be interesting to see how far the EU would take this case moving forward, should those countries still not get in line, as the EU would say. All right, there's another story I'd like to put to the panel, because two giants of the global economy are locked in a bitter dispute over trade, and the EU is caught in the middle. Well, let's take a look at today's Power Play. An escalating trade war between the world's two largest economies. President Trump has followed through on his threats, imposing tariffs on 170 billion euros worth of Chinese products. And China's Xi Jinping has fought back, levying taxes on U.S. imports valued at around 50 billion euros. So what is this all about? Washington believes China is engaging in unfair trade practices, but China has responded by accusing the U.S. of trade bullyism. And there's no end in sight. China has called off planned trade talks with the U.S., and Donald Trump is threatening more tariffs if the two sides can't reach a deal. The rising tensions leave the EU in a difficult position. Brussels is working with the U.S. to reform China's commercial policies, but is also hoping Donald Trump will withdraw sanctions he imposed on the EU earlier this year. All right, we have 2 minutes for this. I'll go to both of you. Marietje first, because the U.S. is your dossier. Mm-hmm. Where do you think the EU should be positioning itself in this trade dispute between China and the U.S.?
I think there's only one place for the EU to stand, and that is with rules-based trade. And when China violates the rules... Does that mean the U.S.? Sorry?
Does that mean the United States?
No, but this is not about what camp do you choose. This is about standing for principles, adhering to WTO rules, strengthening the multilateral system. And I think the EU should stand with those rules. And when China violates them, we challenge China. When the US violates them, we challenge the US.
All right. And what do you think, Bruno? I mean, with the US paying more attention to China, do you think it actually puts the EU in a good position?
I think the way the Americans have played it, and the Americans are really good negotiator. I mean, they play it very, very hard. Whatever the administration, whether it's Obama, Clinton, Bush, or Trump, the Americans play it really, really, really hard. But I think the way that Trump has recast the whole debate is to say who benefits from trade, and I think that's a profound discussion, which, you know, sticking up for the WTO, sticking up for the rule-based order doesn't really address. The WTO is moribund. The Doha round showed that. Changing the schedules for Croatia to join the EU took over 5 years. This isn't a fleet of foot. These are not quick institutions that can deal with people's concerns
I agree.
over trade. And I think what Trump is getting at, and Europeans are way back on, is the fact that most people, when they look at increased GDP, don't see their living standards getting better.
No,
and so Trump is really keying in and says, who benefits?
Way ahead in?
No, the EU is way ahead because we have much stronger social safety nets, redistribution and mitigation of the negatives of trade. So I think it is not correct to state that the EU is behind. We just have a very different system of redistributing the macroeconomic gains from trade. And the fundamental difference in reading global economic chains and trade flows is that Trump sees it as zero sum. So whenever somebody benefits, we must be losing. We in Europe see it as everybody should benefit, and if there are negatives, which there are, of global trade, we should take measures to absorb those negatives.
This trade dispute is bound to continue, and we will be keeping a very, very close eye on that. But we have a lot more also coming up on the program. After an Italian politician is attacked at an anti-racism protest, and ahead of the new Joe Cox Memorial, we ask the question, is being a politician becoming more perilous? Plus, world leaders gather in New York, and it is expected to get tense between the U.S. and Iran. Will Europe get caught in the middle? That's still ahead. Welcome back to Raw Politics. Now, a violent incident this weekend in Italy has some people questioning how safe is it to be a politician. MEP Eleonora Forenza and her assistant Antonio Perillo were attacked and later hospitalized. Now, members of the far-right Italian group Casa Pound, allegedly armed with bats and chains, stormed an anti-racism demonstration on Friday night and reportedly targeted the far-left politician. Her assistant's condition was said to be serious, and the incident comes just days before Brussels is to unveil Joe Cox Square in honor of the UK politician who was murdered by a member of the far right in the run-up to the Brexit referendum in 2016. So I think the question is divisive political rhetoric putting public figures at more risk from extremist actions, extremism? With me to discuss this is our political editor joining us again, Darren McCaffrey. We have Swedish MEP for the Green Party, Linnea Engström, and joining us again is Dutch MEP with the ALDE Group, Marietje Schaake. Linnea, thanks for being with us on this panel. I'd like to start with you. I mean, are there any instances that you've heard of, these? Do you yourself get threats as a politician?
Yes, I've been threatened, but I feel that it's mostly these kind of harassment, let's say, comments or nasty vocabulary that you're affected by. But of course, when you get into feminist issues or anti-racist work or LGBT rights, then you're immediately kind of targeted with these.
Do you get this online mostly?
Yes, online, yes, and emails and what kind of degrading, let's say. But I've never been attacked or harassed like that as a politician. But sometimes, of course, you feel that when you're in a public space and someone might be, you know, you feel that this person might be not 100% all the time with you, let's say. Yeah.
And what about you, Marietje? Do you get threatened as a politician?
I think it happens to all of us, but as a politician you should have a thick skin and be able to handle quite strong language, especially online. It's unavoidable, and also against women, I would say it can be quite specific and horrific. But I think the line should be drawn at violence. It's absolutely unacceptable. And I really hope that people across political parties, across party lines, different countries can unite behind that message that we will not tolerate violence against democratically elected representatives.
Right, let's look at the reaction of that politician that we saw, Emanuele Forenza, earlier, who was attacked. Let's listen to what she had to say.
Ci hanno inseguiti, tirapugni, cazzottiere, spranghe, cinghie, e questi sono i risultati. Ci sono 2 persone in ospedale in questo momento, nel pieno centro della città. Un'aggressione fascista nel pieno centro della città.
So there we have it. We have that far-left politician who was attacked in Italy, and she was talking about bats, chains, Eleonora Forenza, as well as her assistant, Antonio Perillo. Darren, what do you think? Is this a situation that's getting worse because of divisive rhetoric?
I think it is. I was on the plane, actually, with David Cameron when we were going to Gibraltar. It was during the EU referendum campaign when we found out that Joe Cox, the Labour MP, had been murdered. And we obviously turned straight around and went back. And I remember reporting outside our home for many days afterwards. And there's a sense of shock there was, because thankfully, political assassinations in Western Europe are still very, very rare. And as they should be. But I think what has changed in the last decade or so, because previously, you have to remember, a lot of people talked about how bland politics was, how we didn't really have politicians anymore, we simply had managers of the status quo. That is clearly no longer the case. We've got very divisive politics, particularly here in Europe and indeed in the States. And that has allowed a militance grouping, both on the left and the right, who do have this violent streak in them. And I think we are starting to see a rise in political violence. And that is worrying. Yeah. It's good that people are taking part in political discourse. It should be encouraged. It's great that people are engaged in big issues. I think one of the reasons, though, is that both the left and the right, Tessa, are portraying this as a battle. As particularly the right, as a sense of patriotism, that, you know, if someone is against you, they're committing treason in some form. And that is why we're starting to see the growth in this violence.
And I think what's interesting, and if we notice what's happening in Europe, is that the rhetoric that we see normally on the far, as you say, the far right and far left, it's making its way to mainstream conversation. I mean, is there responsibility that political groups, for example, that use such words should be taking?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, words have meaning, you know, and if you keep drumming people up and say you have to resist by all means necessary, there will be people who will take that as, you know, a call to action. And so I think a very hot debate, strong words, it's all part of it. I'm all for freedom of expression, especially in the political arena. But there's also responsibility, and the line has to be drawn when it comes to violence. Unacceptable.
I think words can be very violent. Actually, we have had this case in Sweden where the first case where it was a woman who threatened during 2 years or more a women politician that was a famous anti-racist. I think that is also unacceptable, actually, because it's also violent language, like constantly being harassed by these words. It's also can be very, very...
And social media really doesn't help this too. I mean, you look at things like Twitter. It is a bit of the Wild West out there, where people using anonymity can essentially say what they want to who they want at the click of a button. And that does spiral, and it can spiral. It's so incredibly difficult. You do have to have freedom of speech. We're not talking about the regulation of the internet. But there has to be some form where people are rowed back in again.
Yeah, I think the legal system has to take this seriously, because I've had colleagues, I know politicians who have repeatedly tried to file a case against harassers who have been harassing them for years. And the legal system has to take it seriously. And I think this thick skin that you're talking about, that's okay when you have a negotiation, when you're in a political room. But we're not supposed to take any violent kind of language when you're out
so
meeting voters.
So how do you deal with that? I mean, within the plenary sessions, I mean, you have some your colleagues here who you might actually think are pushing that kind of language.
So I haven't seen that here in the plenary, but I think online, things you're talking about, like racism, inciting violence.
So you haven't seen that
threatening.
Here. Okay.
No, there have been comments, and the president of the parliament has taken action against one individual that I remember who was making derogatory comments against a female colleague. So there is also the power and authority of the president to take action, to reprimand someone, to punish someone. But I think we should be careful with stifling speech, but also not be shy to use the law. When it comes to racism, it is against the law. Inciting hatred is illegal in most countries. Hate speech can be prosecuted. So it's not like there are no means existing already. But I also think that we all, especially in the center, especially those who want to fight this deep polarization, have our own responsibility to try to bring people together, not to put oil on the fire. Because, sometimes there can also be, I think, attractive sides to polarize
there can be
more.
There can be an attempt for people to ape each other, to
extremes
almost
always
start
fan
using
each
the
other.
language of everyone else. And the way not to deal with this is clearly more protection, which is certainly the route that people in the United States would go down. I think it's trying to change actually fundamentally the discourse. Using the law is a legitimate way to do it, but it is by trying to change the discourse and the language and to a degree the means and the facilities
it has to have
people
consequences when someone is behaving bad. And how are we going to say to our children, don't bully each other? Because we as adults are bullying each other every day in social media.
I mean, this is such an interesting discussion that can go on and on and on. Thank you for your insight on this topic. But again, we have a lot more for you coming up after the break. We have a showdown. It's expected this week at the UN between the US and Iran, and Europe is in the middle. That's after a break. Welcome back to Our Politics. The UN General Assembly begins in New York this week. World leaders will have the opportunity to address their counterparts and the world. Well, our team in the Cube and Alex Morgan has been looking into what to expect. Alex.
Well, Tessa, a lot of focus on Iran and a potential face-off between the US president and the Iranian president in New York this week, as world leaders are gathering in the city to obviously attend the General Assembly. US Ambassador Nikki Haley saying it's going to be a busy week, a chaotic week. Well, the one thing I think which is really striking going into this is the rising tensions there have been between the United States and Iran. And that was exacerbated this weekend, particularly after a deadly terrorist attack in Iran, which left at least 25 people dead. The Iranian foreign minister then tweeted that attack, he blamed it on terrorist sponsors in the region. And look at this word, their US masters, saying effectively here, laying the blame for this deadly attack at the feet of the United States. Now, needless to say, Nikki Haley then went on American television across the weekend and rejected these Iranian claims that America was behind this attack. But you can see here this back and forth, increasing tensions between America and Iran. And Donald Trump put a real spanner in the works by announcing last week that he will be chairing a session of the UN Security Council on Iran, giving the topic away there. Now, why is this going to increase tension so much? Well, let's not forget, Donald Trump unilaterally tore up that Iran nuclear deal for America and walked away. His European allies, Britain and France, permanent members of the UN Security Council, and of course, then all the other European allies, firmly standing behind the deal. America going into this are going to be wanting support for walking away from the deal. The European allies have the opposite approach. And in fact, we can just bring you this video. This is Mogherini, the EU foreign policy chief, now meeting with the Iranian foreign minister. These scenes, a world away from the US policy of walking away from Iran, piling pressure on the regime. You can see here the tensions are not just between America and a traditional foe, but now over the question of Iran, the tensions seem to be ratcheting up between America and their traditional allies. The 20th century seemed to be the century the Atlantic got much smaller in terms of policy. Well, on this issue at least, it seems the distance between America and Europe is greater than it's ever been.
All right, thank you for that, Alex and the Cube team. And joining us for this panel is, we still have our political editor, Darren McCaffrey, and joining us, Bulgarian MEP with the EPP, Andrei Kovatchov, and Bruno Waterfield from The Times. I'd like to put this to you, as Alex was talking about there, the US, Europe, are we seeing a power play? I would ask you.
First of all, more general, what is the role of the United Nations at all now in the world? We see so much bilateral issues which are, so to say, continue to try to be solved bilaterally, and this multilateralism, the role of the United Nations is somehow undermined. And I think our goal in Europe, in the European Parliament, what we here voted, the recommendations to the General Assembly, is to strengthen the United Nations and to give more power to this multilateralism, to find the solutions like here, for example, Iran or Middle East or Africa.
Europe with two different positions. You know, you've got two powers with two different positions on an issue like Iran, for example.
Not only Iran, but on the Paris climate,
so it is,
on UNESCO, on so many other issues, migration.
Yeah, so what are you watching for? Because, you know, Trump is getting the headlines now. What are you looking forward to in this session?
Well, the UN General Assembly, or UNGAR, as it's known as in this town by all the people going to stay, whizzing off to New York, to stay in their lovely hotels. It's a great jolly, actually, because the event itself is, of course, you know, deeply, deeply tedious as dictator after dictator stands up to pontificate with speeches that are far too long. So in one sense, I suppose Trump is sort of livening it up a bit. I think it's important to note, though, on Iran, that really the Europeans and the Americans disagree about the means, not the end. In terms of Iran and Iran getting a nuclear weapon, both sides completely concur. It's just that Trump feels that the Europeans gave too much away. So the splits aren't really as great as they seem. It's a means and end discussion. But Trump certainly is likely to shake things up.
I'd like to ask something about Europe, because on Thursday we have Juncker and Tusk speaking. I put it to Andrei. How different do you think their messages will be?
Well, we try to continue our partnership with the United Nations and to find a common solution.
But between Tusk and Juncker, for example, the way that they would deliver their speeches, knowing what we know about them.
I know between Juncker and Tusk, I don't expect that there will be a much different statement on this. But on the main topic on our planet, European Union, we try always to find common solution and not to go to bilateral or to issues which under closed doors, and to find something what can unite us and find real solution in Syria. For us in European Union, Syria is a very important issue.
But that's something to see if whether they will come up with one consistent message. What do you think, Darren?
Well, we know that, you know, this is all part of Jean-Claude Juncker's attempt to kind of put Europe at the centre of the world stage. We know he's going to focus on particularly Africa, which has become a big part of the end of his presidency in terms of that. They are two very different characters in lots of ways, with two very strong competing egos. And it is a platform, as Bruno pointed out. We've seen everything from Benjamin Netanyahu drawing graphs to Donald Trump talking about Rocket Man.
And then there's Rocket Man, yeah.
So, you know, it is a big platform, but it is a platform, I think, where the European Union now feels that it needs to concert itself, given the perceived isolationism of other former global
Europe
powers.
on the world stage, isn't it, that we're closely watching. Now, we have you ever seen two people shaking hands? I mean, we'll see a lot of shaking hands at the United Nations. Yeah, tonight. Now, sometimes when you see them doing that, you have the urge to get into the action. It seems you're not the only one. Let's look at today's raw moment from the UN General Assembly, where Jean-Claude Juncker met Antonio Guterres and Moussa Faki. these lighten up the mood, don't they?
Theater.
Do you think it's theater?
The thing is, we've all been there, though. We've all shaken someone's hand rather awkwardly. I always think it's quite difficult, though, when there's obviously lots of cameras around and there's more than one person. But, I mean, I've got a little bit of sympathy. We've all misjudged those situations.
I mean, there's so many awkward moments, right? I mean, because of, we have a lot, when we talk about this behind the scenes, we have a lot of examples. Now, let's look at some of our favorite awkward handshakes over recent years. Take a look. I will ask all of you, what's your favorite one, Bruno?
I like the Macron-Trump because Trump's ambushed people. Macron watched YouTube, boned up on it and just got him. And there was something just very good entertainment about it. I feel a bit sorry for him, though, because I remember Jose Manuel Barroso, who used to be president of the Commission, he used to say, imagine my job, I have to shake hands with people who I really don't like. And I think this is the problem.
We don't often have to do that
ourselves. It's like a power play also.
It's also always the pat on the back. It's always that is a proper power play, a pat on the back.
Well, thank you very much for being with us today, and thank you for joining us on Raw Politics. I'm on Twitter at Tessa Arcilia or at Euronews, and use the hashtag Raw Politics. See you again tomorrow.